The pungent smell of sage and dust swirled around Josephine Finley as she stumbled down the rutted dirt road, her boots worn thin and her stomach even emptier. The year was 1878, and the promise of opportunity in the Wyoming Territory had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh western sun. 3 days without a proper meal had left her lightheaded, but the smoke curling from a chimney in the distance gave her hope that perhaps her luck was about to change. The ranch house sat nestled against rolling hills, weathered but sturdy, with a corral of horses to one side and cattle grazing in the distance. Josephine smoothed her faded blue dress, adjusted the worn shawl around her shoulders, and gathered her courage. She needed work desperately, having fled a bad situation in Denver with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle of possessions. As she approached, a boy of about 10 years came racing around the corner of the barn, nearly colliding with her. "Whoa there," Josephine said, steadying herself. The boy looked up at her with curious eyes. "Who are you, madam?" "My name is Josephine Finley. I was wondering if your family might have any work available." The boy studied her for a moment. Pause inside. "I'm Thomas Pierce." He turned and hollered toward the house. "Pa, there's a lady here." The door swung open, and a tall man emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. His face was weathered from years under the sun, his brown hair streaked with touches of early gray at the temples. Despite the hard lines of his face, his eyes were kind if cautious. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant. "I'm Josephine Finley. I'm looking for work, sir, any kind of work. I can cook clean, so tend to children." The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed her. "I'm Wyatt Pierce. This is my ranch. It's just me and my boy here, and we're managing fine." Thomas tugged at his father's sleeve. "But, Pa, we ain't had a proper meal since Ma died. This lady says she can cook." Wyatt Pierce's face softened slightly at his son's words, and Josephine caught a glimpse of the grief that still shadowed his eyes. She understood then a widow-rower struggling to raise a child alone while running a ranch. "I don't mean to impose, Mr. Pierce, but I'm a very good cook. Perhaps I could prepare a meal for you both as a demonstration of my skills. If you're not satisfied, I'll be on my way." Wyatt hesitated, but Thomas looked up at him with pleading eyes. "Please, Pa, one meal," Wyatt conceded reluctantly. "Then we'll talk." Josephine followed them inside to a kitchen that clearly hadn't seen a woman's touch in some time. Pots were stacked haphazardly, dishes were piled in the sink, and the stove was coated with grease, but she merely rolled up her sleeves and set to work. "What supplies do you have?" she asked. Thomas eagerly showed her the pantry, while Wyatt watched from the doorway, arms crossed and expression guarded, despite the limited ingredients. Josephine managed to prepare a hearty stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and even a simple apple pie from the dried fruit she found tucked away. When they sat down to eat, Thomas devoured his food with enthusiasm. "This is just like Ma used to make," he exclaimed, reaching for seconds before he'd even finished his first serving. Wyatt ate more slowly, but Josephine noticed the way his eyes closed briefly with each bite, as if savoring a pleasure long forgotten. The kitchen was warmer now, filled with the aroma of home-cooked food and the sound of Thomas's animated chatter. After dinner, as Josephine washed the dishes, she heard Thomas speaking to his father in the next room. "She makes the house happy. Pa, let her stay." There was a long silence before Wyatt responded, his voice too low for her to catch the words. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face was still serious but less rigid than before. "Miss Finley," he began, "I can offer you room and board, plus $5 a month to cook and help with some of the household chores. It's not much, but it's what I can afford." Relief washed over her. "That would be more than fair, Mr. Pierce. Thank you. There's a small room off the kitchen. It was meant for a housekeeper, though we've never had one. You can make it your own." That night, in the tiny room with its narrow bed and single window, Josephine felt something she hadn't felt in months safe. As she drifted off to sleep, she told herself this arrangement was temporary, just until she saved enough to move on. She didn't need to get attached to this quiet rancher and his earnest son. The next morning, Josephine rose before dawn and had coffee brewing by the time Wyatt came in from his early chores. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident on his face at the sight of her bustling around his kitchen as if she belonged there. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce," she said cheerfully. "Breakfast will be ready shortly. I hope you like flapjacks. I haven't had flapjacks since." He trailed off, and she understood the unspoken reference to his late wife. "Thomas mentioned they were his favorite," she said gently. Wyatt nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Yes, they are. Over the next few weeks Josephine fell into a comfortable routine. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, mended clothes, and even planted a small vegetable garden behind the kitchen. Thomas followed her around whenever he wasn't helping his father, eager for her attention and stories. "How come you know so many things, Miss Josie?" he asked one afternoon as she taught him how to make a simple stew. "I've had many jobs, Thomas, and please just call me Josie." She smiled at the boy, surprised by how quickly she'd grown fond of him. "Did you have a family before you came here?" he asked innocently. Josephine's hand stilled for a moment. "I did once. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my aunt in St. Louis. How'd you end up all the way out here?" She carefully chose her words. "I was looking for a fresh start." "Just like P after Ma died," Thomas observed with the simple wisdom of children. "He says sometimes you got to pick up and start over." Josephine nodded, touched by the parallel Thomas had drawn. "Your father is a wise man." Speaking of Wyatt, the man himself remained something of a mystery to Josephine. He was unfailingly polite, but kept his distance, leaving early for work around the ranch, and often returning late. When they did share meals, he spoke little, though she occasionally caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. One evening in early June, nearly a month after her arrival, a violent thunderstorm rolled in. Josephine was reading to Thomas by the fire when the first crash of thunder shook the house. "I best check on the horses," Wyatt said, rising from his chair. "Thomas, you stay here with Miss Finley." "But, Pa, it's awful bad out there," Thomas protested. "All the more reason to make sure the animals are secure," Wyatt replied, already donning his slicker. Josephine felt a stab of worry. "Be careful, Mr. Pierce." He glanced at her, seeming momentarily surprised by her concern. "Always am, Miss Finley." After he left, Thomas grew increasingly anxious as the storm intensified. Lightning flashed continuously, and the wind howled around the eaves of the house. "Pa should be back by now," Thomas fretted, pressing his face against the window. Josephine tried to distract him with stories, but she too was growing concerned. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the door burst open and Wyatt staggered in, drenched and supporting a bleeding arm. "Wyatt!" Josephine cried, forgetting formality in her alarm. She rushed to help him to a chair. "What happened?" Lightning spooked the horses got thrown against the fence. He grimaced as she helped him remove his wet coat. "It's nothing serious," but the gash on his arm suggested otherwise. Josephine quickly gathered clean cloths and her small jar of healing salve. "Thomas, fetch some hot water from the kettle, please," she instructed, rolling up Wyatt's sleeve to expose the wound. As she carefully cleaned and bandaged his arm, Josephine was acutely aware of his eyes on her face. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and despite the circumstances, she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. "You've done this before," he observed quietly. "My aunt was a midwife. She taught me a bit about tending wounds." Josephine finished securing the bandage. "There, it should heal clean if you're careful with it." "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Thomas, who had been watching anxiously, threw his arms around his father's neck. "I told you Miss Josie knows everything. P, ain't you glad she's here?" Wyatt's eyes met Josephine's over his son's head. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Something shifted between them after that night. Wyatt no longer seemed to avoid her company. Instead, he began lingering at the breakfast table, sharing news about the ranch or asking her opinion on matters regarding Thomas's education. He even started helping with the dishes after supper, standing beside her at the sink in companionable silence. One Sunday in July, when the summer heat made the air shimmer above the distant hills, Wyatt surprised her by announcing they were taking a day of rest. "I thought we might have a picnic by the creek," he said almost shyly at breakfast. "Thomas has been asking to go fishing, and it's too hot for much else." Josephine's heart quickened at the invitation. "That sounds lovely. I'll pack us a lunch." The creek was a beautiful spot, shaded by cottonwoods and willows, with clear water running over smooth stones. Thomas immediately stripped off his boots and waded in while Wyatt found a comfortable spot on the bank to set up their fishing lines. Josephine spread a blanket in the shade and arranged their picnic fried chicken, biscuits, fresh pickles from her garden, and blackberry pie. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, content in a way she hadn't been in years. "You have a nice voice," Wyatt said, settling beside her on the blanket. She felt herself blush. "My mother used to sing all the time. I suppose I inherited that from her." "What was she like, your mother?" he asked, accepting the plate she offered him. Josephine was surprised by the question. They rarely spoke of personal matters. She was kind, strong. She could make something out of nothing. A feast from scraps, a dress from flour sacks. But she laughed easily, too. "Our house was always full of music." "She sounds like you," Wyatt said quietly. Their eyes met, and Josephine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun. Before she could respond, Thomas came splashing up from the creek, proudly displaying a small fish he'd caught. "Look, Pa, Miss Josie, I caught supper." The moment passed, but something had changed. As the day progressed, Josephine found herself increasingly aware of Wyatt. The way the sun brought out golden highlights in his brown hair, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the gentle patience he showed with his son in the late afternoon when Thomas had fallen asleep in the shade after swimming, Wyatt moved to sit beside Josephine on the blanket. "I never thanked you properly," he said, his voice low so as not to wake his son. "For what?" "For bringing life back into our home." He looked at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "It's been a dark place since Margaret died 3 years ago." "I thought it always would be." Josephine felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I should be thanking you. You gave me a chance when I desperately needed one. Where were you going that day? You showed up at our door." She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I didn't know. I was running from a bad situation in Denver, a man who she trailed off, unwilling to speak the full truth." Wyatt's expression darkened. "Did he hurt you?" "He tried to," she admitted. "I left before he could." His hand moved slightly toward hers on the blanket, not quite touching. "You're safe here, Josephine. You should know that." The way he said her full name with such care made her heart skip. I do know that as summer faded into autumn, Josephine found herself thinking less about moving on and more about staying. The ranch began to feel like home, and Thomas had firmly worked his way into her heart with his endless curiosity and open affection. As for Wyatt, her feelings for him had grown into something she scarcely dared name. They shared small moments, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a cup of coffee, a shared smile across the dinner table at one of Thomas's jokes, quiet conversations by the fire after Thomas had gone to bed. But Wyatt never spoke of anything beyond the present, and Josephine reminded herself that she was still fundamentally an employee. In late September, news came that a group of outlaws had been raiding isolated homesteads in the area. Wyatt began carrying his rifle when he went out to work, and his face grew tense with worry. "Perhaps you should take Thomas to town until this passes," he suggested one evening. "You'd be safer there and leave you here alone." "Absolutely not," Josephine replied firmly. "This is our home, and we'll defend it together if need be." The words slipped out before she could catch them. "Our home," but Wyatt didn't correct her. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Josephine," he began, but was interrupted by Thomas bursting into the room with an arithmetic problem he couldn't solve. The moment passed, but the tension between them continued to build. Josephine found herself wondering what might have happened if Thomas hadn't appeared when he did. Would Wyatt have finally spoken the words she longed to hear? She didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 nights later, the sound of approaching horses woke her from a fitful sleep. Peering out her window, she saw 4 riders approaching the ranch house, their faces obscured by bandanas. Grabbing her shawl, she hurried to Wyatt's room. She found him already awake, loading his rifle. "They're here," she whispered. 4 of them. Wyatt nodded grimly. "Wake Thomas. Take him to the root cellar and stay there. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I come for you." "What?" "No, please, Josephine." His eyes met hers in the darkness, filled with an emotion that stole her breath. "I can't focus on protecting this place if I'm worried about you too." She wanted to argue, but the sound of boots on the porch decided her. Quickly she roused Thomas and led him to the root cellar beneath the kitchen, a small space accessed through a trapdoor in the floor. "What's happening, Miss Josie?" Thomas asked, his voice small with fear as she closed the trapdoor above them. "Your father is protecting our home," she said, holding the boy close. "He's very brave and very good at what he does." They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of men's voices, then a shout, and finally gunshots 3 in rapid succession. Thomas buried his face against her shoulder, and Josephine prayed silently, her heart racing. The waiting seemed endless. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they heard footsteps crossing the kitchen floor above them. "Josephine, Thomas, it's safe now." Wyatt's voice sent a wave of relief through her, so powerful she nearly wept. She pushed open the trap door to find him standing there, rifle in hand, a small cut above his eye, but otherwise unharmed. "You're hurt," she said, climbing out and reaching to touch his face. "It's nothing." He caught her hand in his. "They're gone. 2 ran off after I winged one of them. Sheriff Johnson and his deputy arrived just in time to catch the other 2. Thomas emerged from the cellar and threw himself at his father. "I was scared, Pa." "I know, son. But you were brave, staying hidden like I asked." Wyatt held his son close, then looked up at Josephine over the boy's head. "You both were." Later, after Thomas had been settled back to sleep and the sheriff had departed with his prisoners, Josephine and Wyatt sat at the kitchen table, a lamp burning low between them. She had cleaned the cut on his forehead, her hands gentle on his skin. "I kept thinking," Wyatt said suddenly, breaking the silence. "What if something happened to me tonight? What would become of Thomas?" He paused, his eyes finding hers. "And what would become of you?" Josephine's heart quickened. "I would have taken care of Thomas," she said softly. "I know you would." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "But that's not the way it should be. You're not just our housekeeper, Josephine. Surely you know that by now." She felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "What am I, then?" "The woman I've fallen in love with," he said simply. "The woman who brought warmth and light back into our lives when I thought they were gone forever." Tears sprang to her eyes. "Wyatt, I don't have much to offer. Just this ranch, a sometimes difficult boy, and a man who's been alone too long." His thumb stroked the back of her hand. "But everything I have is yours if you want it." Josephine rose from her chair and moved around the table to him. Gently she laid her hand against his cheek. "I want it, all of it. I want you and Thomas in this life we've built. I love you both so much." When his lips finally met hers, it felt like coming home. His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a hunger that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Josephine," he whispered. "Be my wife. Be Thomas's mother in truth as well as in heart." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Thomas standing proudly beside his father, and the entire community turning out to witness the union. Josephine wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself with wild flowers in her hair. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. And when Wyatt kissed her, the cheers from the congregation were nearly drowned out by Thomas's enthusiastic whooping. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard, and everyone bringing dishes to share. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the land they now shared, Wyatt found Josephine standing alone for a moment, watching Thomas play with the other children. "Happy, Mrs. Pierce?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when Thomas said you made the house happy that first day, I was afraid to believe him, afraid to hope, and now I know he was right. But it's more than that." Wyatt turned her to face him, his eyes full of love. "You didn't just make the house happy, Josephine. You made me happy. You made us whole again." As the years passed, the Pierce ranch flourished. Josephine's garden expanded, and she became known throughout the county for her preserves and baked goods. Wyatt's cattle operation grew, and with Josephine's careful bookkeeping, they were able to add more land and build a larger, more comfortable home. Thomas grew into a fine young man, with his father's strength and his stepmother's kindness. And 2 years after their wedding, he was joined by a baby sister, Elizabeth Margaret Pierce, named for both grandmothers she would never meet, but whose legacy lived on in the love that filled their home. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Wyatt presented Josephine with a small wooden box. Inside was a delicate gold locket. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny portrait of Thomas on one side and baby Elizabeth on the other. Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." "Thank you," Wyatt replied, fastening the chain around her neck. "For everything. For that day you walked up our road. For staying when I gave you every reason to leave. For loving my son as your own. For giving me Elizabeth. For making every day better than the last." Josephine smiled through her tears. "And to think it all started with a desperate woman and a simple meal." "No," Wyatt corrected gently, pulling her into his arms. "It started with a brave woman and a boy who saw what his father was too blind to see. That what we needed most wasn't just someone to cook our meals, but someone to make our house a home again. She makes the house happy." "Pa," Josephine quoted, remembering Thomas's words from that first day. "Let her stay." "Smartest thing that boy ever said," Wyatt murmured against her lips before kissing her deeply. And as the sun set over the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Josephine Pierce knew that she had found not just safety or security, but the truest happiness, a family to love, a purpose to fulfill, and a man who cherished her above all else. From the darkest moment of her life had come the greatest blessing, proving that sometimes the longest journeys lead exactly where we're meant to be.